and welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our guest author is Matthew Bunson, and the book is Saint Pope Paul VI, celebrating the 262nd Pope of the Roman Catholic Church, published by, and proudly by, EWTN. Welcome, Mr. Bunson. You're kind of our all-around Catholic guy.
Hopefully.
You know, wear many, many hats. Our expert on many things, certainly historical, and practices inside the church. Many times our news department goes to you on a regular basis, which is where you spend most of your time when you're not writing books. But you're also involved with a wonderful program that the EWTN team, Peter Gang and his team, have been working on with you, right?
Yeah, it's the Doctors of the Church. So it's the first ever series looking at the lives, writings, and impact of the 36 men and women doctors. And it's been a privilege to work on it.
Got a couple going out. We're trying to make them better and better. One of them's already won an award. Congratulations to you and all the guys working on the program. So let's talk about St. Paul VI. It's interesting because he's kind of, you know, he's a little lost these days, you know, and certainly you would fair to say that many people who had concerns about Vatican II, you know, they kind of weren't crazy about John the 23rd, but they, in many ways, seem to blame Paul VI for the fact that it kind of got out of control. Was that fair?
I think it's understandable, let's put it that way. Paul VI has suffered from two great disabilities over the years. The first was that he's Pope between good Pope St. John, who ushered in the age of aggiornamento, of reform in the church, the council. We have that very, very brief couple of weeks of John Paul I, and then comes this colossus of St. John Paul II, the Great, who is a saint. He's called the Great. He's likely to be a doctor of the church. So Pope then for 25 years. So Paul was almost immediately overshadowed by both. He succeeded one of the most popular saints in modern history, in John. And as I said, he was followed by John Paul II. But then he also had the terrible role, the task of trying to implement the Second Vatican Council to pick up where John left it, implement it in a world that seemed at times to have been going crazy.
How far were we into the council when John the 23rd
The first
died?
session had wrapped up, and everyone knew, and this is the end of 62 into 63, everyone knew that John was dying.
Because he had stomach cancer?
He had stomach cancer.
Right. Okay.
And so his frailty was mounting as the preparations for the council went, and then with the opening of the council, so everyone knew that he wasn't going to be finishing it, which raised the immediate question of who was going to follow him. And this is one of the other classic problems that Giovanni Battista Montini faced throughout his whole life, that there was this, he was always dealing with a set of expectations. He was expected to become a cardinal. He was expected to become pope.
Right. Let me ask you that, because obviously there's you talk about later in the book about the fact when he turned down, along with another bishop, about becoming a cardinal, and this idea that he was expected to become pope. How does somebody get expected to become pope? I mean, we as Catholics like to believe, certainly, that the Holy Spirit is guiding people at the time that it's happening.
Right. Not
that there were people like popes in waiting, or people who are being groomed to be pope.
Yeah, I'm not sure if groomed is exactly the word, but if you look throughout the history of the church, there have been certain leaders in the church who became cardinals that everyone, even especially in the College of Cardinals, would look to and say, he has all of the qualities that one would expect for a good, and we hope, holy pope. Eugenio Pacelli, in 1939, at the death of Pius XI, everyone knew that he was going to be elected pope. There was no real mystery.
Pius XII.
That's Pius XII. He goes in, it's one of the shortest conclaves in history, at a moment when the world is on the brink of total catastrophe. And there was one person in the church that the cardinals knew, that anyone who really followed the church knew, this had to be the next pope. He was positioned perfectly for it. And in much the same way, there were certain expectations surrounding Montini.
Right. Is that because they had to do with dealing with diplomacy and things like that, and the relationships inside the church as well?
Exactly. With Montini, it was always his talent, his remarkable prudence. In fact, he's been criticized for that. At one point in his career, he was called Hamlet because it seemed to take him so long to make a decision.
Right.
He was mocked for it, and even in the years after his death, it was said that he would deliberate too long about things. But his prudence was one thing, his intelligence was the other. But people who worked with him in the Vatican, let's remember he worked in the Secretariat of State for decades, recognized his greatest feature was his incredible work ethic. He could work so hard, and that was something that Pius XII knew, which is why he trusted him as he did, as one of his most faithful lieutenants, as sostituto was the title. So he essentially ran the Vatican machine of state under Pius, and he did it remarkably well.
Well, you mentioned the fact that, and you talk in the very beginning about when he was elected, and the fact that in his acceptance, he talks about I accepted the keys of the kingdom of heaven, keys that were heavy, powerful, and mysterious. And you say Paul's reference to the heaviness of the keys is significant, for it could be argued that the way to the papacy had begun for Montini, not on June 21st, but at the moment he had become a cardinal in 58. So from the point in time you're saying that he became a cardinal, he knew he was going to probably be pope. And they knew that with the advanced age of John the 23rd, it wouldn't be that long.
That's right.
Okay.
And we go back to 1952. You mentioned it a couple of minutes ago. Pius XII wanted to reward two of his most faithful lieutenants, as I was saying. One is Montini, the other is Domenico Tardini. Montini essentially ran, as I was saying, the sort of the Vatican machinery of state. Tardini was, think of it as a foreign minister. He was very good at the papal diplomacy. And Pius, who had for so many years filled himself the role of Secretary of State, in other words, he ran everything himself, which was his style because he had the genius to do it. He wanted to make them cardinals as a thank you. Both of them declined the red hat. Now, it's still something of a mystery as to why. It was said at the time that they did this out of humility, that they just felt that they didn't want to do this. Paul has been accused of trying to avoid the red hat, that perhaps he also knew that he would be the likely person to succeed Pius XII. We don't know his precise motivations. So in 1954, Pius appoints Montini the Archbishop of Milan, which took a lot of people by surprise. It was the largest archdiocese in Europe, one of the largest archdioceses in the world, one of the most prominent in the whole of Italy, and it was fraught with social problems, especially coming out of World War II. It was a communist hotbed.
Right, the workers' movement stuff.
It was an industrial center. There were all kinds of problems there, social, political, and economic. So the question then was, why did Pius XII seemingly exile this Archbishop Montini to
get
Milan?
Him some pastoral experience.
That was the one way that it could be interpreted.
That's what you were saying.
That's exactly. And if that's the case, then Pius XII knew that at some point Montini would likely be elected pope. Now let's remember that John Paul II was the first non-Italian cardinal to be elected since the early 16th century. So it was likely to be an Italian. Pius knew this. But then he died in 1958 without summoning another conclave, another consistory, I should say, to create new cardinals.
He only had, what, two?
He only had two. So Montini was not a cardinal at the time of Pius XII's death, which meant that he was not a participant in the conclave to elect his successor. It has been said that
would he have voted for John the 23rd?
My understanding is that he probably did vote for Montini, for Roncalli. The question, though, that comes up is, if it wasn't Roncalli, then who might it have been? And that raises all sorts of interesting speculation. The very first act on the part of the newly minted Pope John the 23rd was to appoint Montini a cardinal. He was the first of the cardinals that he named. And it is said that when the new cardinal Montini came to him and did this act of obeisance.
You described that in the book, right?
John says, we both know that had you been a cardinal, I would now be giving obeisance to you.
You talk about the fact that you're talking about a period of shocking social political change, including the sexual revolution, obviously known today for Humanae Vitae, which reaffirmed the Church's teachings on contraception, though it seems to be under attack again. It's always under attack, but sometimes more so even inside, sometimes the Church than outside. You also make the point that he never issued another encyclical, but later on in the book you also make the point that he did those exhortations. Because some people kind of treated it like, well, he did that, and then he got yelled at, and then he kind of went and hid. But he didn't do that.
No, it's a careful study of the way that his last years unfolded. He saw Humani Vitae as almost the last word of his pontificate in terms of encyclicals, sort of these very formal papal teachings. I think he wanted Humani Vitae, the reaffirmation of the Church's teachings on human life, on marriage and sexuality, but also as this a prophetic document, which it was, in great fear of where we would be heading with the contraceptive culture. So instead, he began trying to implement the council through exhortations, through speeches, also up until the mid-70s, through travels, as a way of talking.
Which is why he took Paul in the first place, right?
Exactly. He wanted to be a missionary. He wanted to bring Christ out to the world. And in fact, he then became the most traveled pope in history right up until the time of John Paul II.
Right.
So these exhortations then become important to read, and by far the most significant, I would argue, was Evangelii Nuntiandi in 1975, that was on evangelization in the New World, that John Paul II was able to take and begin building his own vision for evangelization, and even Pope Benedict XVI with the new evangelization.
Right.
We always go back to Evangelii Nuntiandi as this blueprint for evangelization in the modern world.
Right. Well, it's interesting you talk about the fact that he continued to do things to call Catholics to evangelize, to love the Eucharist, to be holy, to be aware of the dangers of the age while understanding the signs of the times. What do you think he meant by the signs of the times?
I think he understood them in certainly the classic sense of look at the movements of history, but also look at how the Holy Spirit has always guided the Church in those movements, in those moments of crisis and doubt, which is why his speech in 1972, the famous Smoke of Satan speech, I think is so significant.
Right. Right, and you kind of talk about that and try to put that into context. People hear that and they think, oh, well, look back, see, that's what happened, that's what we're dealing with. The devil's, some people put and say, well, now we know why there's so many problems in the church, or why we can't trust what's going on in Rome anymore because these things have been corrupted. Certainly there's people who claim to be Catholic, who don't believe the Pope is the Pope for the last several popes, not just recently. But in the book, you kind of put it in context. Why don't you explain that?
Well, here we were 7 years or so after the end of the council. And as Paul himself, in this homily that he delivers in 1972, talks about that at the end of the council, this was supposed to be a time of joy, of optimism, of hope. Instead, we are looking at a time of pessimism, of gloom. And then he says some interesting things. He says, no one trusts the church anymore. And he says, everyone seems to follow the first prophet who comes down the street, and they chase after them, asking him, what is the meaning of life? He says, and that's where that line comes in. He says, it is as though a fissure has opened and the smoke of Satan has billowed out. Terrifying concept. The image is vivid. It's horrifying. But then he goes on to say that, which is why I want to reaffirm my role as successor of Peter in affirming you, my brothers and sisters, in the faith. So it's sort of a microcosm of what he tried to do in his last years as Pope, to, in a world filled with doubt, the sexual revolution, political revolutions, where everything was being greeted with cynicism and fear.
And everything was up for grabs.
And everything was up for grabs. The simple reaffirmation of faith, that this is the solution to what we need in the church, to go back to that faith. That, I think, was his message. And it reminds me a great deal of Cardinal George, the late Cardinal George of Chicago's, that famous comment about, I will die in my bed, my successor. At the end of that, terrifying and depressing as it is, he says, and then his successor will pick up the pieces as we have always done. So people tend to leave off that last part with Paul and with George. And it's a reminder of why we have to have hope in that Holy Spirit. And we go back to the signs of the times.
We're passing through things. It's not the end.
Right.
It's just, I remember a great comment he made one time speaking, and he talked about collegiality. He said collegiality is not that all the bishops get to teach what they want and get along. It's that we all teach the same thing.
Yes. With that key qualifier, in communion with Peter.
Right.
In communion with the Pope. And it's why we go back to one of the very first encyclicals that Paul issued in the middle of the council, which is this deep reflection on the church in the modern world. What does he choose as his first topic? But to reflect on the church, Ecclesiam Suam. And he sees and continued to see throughout his pontificate the church as the sign of hope in the world, in a world that was running out of hope. And it's one of the reasons that I really consider Paul to be such a prophet for us today. Because so many of the themes that he was dealing with, we have seen the fruits of his predictions, of his prophecies.
Right. He was very prophetic if you read.
Oh, very much so.
It's amazing.
And the church, though, as it was when Christ founded the church, throughout all of history, it remains the hope. It remains the bark of Peter that where we can find stability and hope in everything that we're facing today.
Right, even if there's rough seas there.
Rough seas.
We're being kicked about. You say you also spoke without doubt, and this I thought was important, especially we've heard recently, that the Second Vatican Council did not represent a rupture from tradition, nor did it propose conformity with the passing and error-filled thinking out of any age. We hear that recently, this idea that somehow on and off that, and Benedict was like, there was no rupture, okay?
Right.
But there have been others who've said, oh, no, this was a sea change for the church. Why does it matter whether there was or wasn't continuity or a rupture?
Well, we're talking about also the idea of the hermeneutic, and that's the theological, philosophical term of, sort of think of it as a lens. How do we view something? And so we have the two schools of hermeneutics, the hermeneutic of rupture or the hermeneutic of continuity and reform. And it's always important to attach continuity and reform together in that. The idea of rupture is that whatever happened before the Second Vatican Council is now unimportant, that this marked an entirely different, a complete change of direction in the life of the church. If that's the case, then everything, you just used the phrase, up for grabs.
Right.
Anything can be looked at. And Cardinal Ratzinger, who would become, of course, Pope Benedict XVI, made that great point that what happened in many ways with the Council was it went from self-examination to a kind of self-destructive self-analysis. What Paul was stressing, and what John Paul II stressed, and what Benedict XVI stressed, is that no, we have to look at the Second Vatican Council in continuity with all of the 21 ecumenical councils, that it stands and builds on them, that it anchors itself in those teachings. Those teachings are unchangeable, but he would also go back to what John the 23rd was trying to accomplish with the council. When he opened the council, the very first thing he said in his opening address was that the point of this is to have the church enter into a dialogue with the modern world to proclaim the unchanging teachings of the church, but in a way that the world can understand.
Right. Well, I know one, Father Benedict Rochelle used to say that the thought process at the time was, we're going to open the windows and everybody's going to become Catholic.
Right.
Instead of the world, they weren't prepared for the world rushing in at the same time.
Right.
You know, kind of a situation.
There's a kind of a microcosm of that, and that was in 1965 when Paul came to the United States. It was a very brief visit.
Went to Yankee Stadium.
Went to Yankee Stadium, yes. I had to mention that.
I had to mention it too.
The event itself was titanic in American history. For American Catholics, this was an incredible moment. We had the Pope addressing the United Nations, where he used that famous phrase, no more war, war never again. Then he says Mass. We're at the close of the council, and everything seemed poised for this new springtime, this new awakening. Within a very short time, the implementation of the council seemed to start falling apart. We had the Dutch Catechism emerge in Europe that was something of a cause célèbre on the left. It was a horror show on the right because of the errors.
We'll see what it did to that country.
In doctrine and teaching and catechism, and so you can chart mass attendance that began to slip. So the problem that Paul had immediately was that you had these sources of influence, these pressures that were building. The council ended right at the breaking of these horrendous storms of the 60s.
Right.
And I'm not sure if they had accounted for that when they left.
Right. It's also interesting, too, in these kinds of things, that the idea that the Montini, thinking about him as a younger man, one of the things that people don't know about, which you brought up, is that he was one of the unknown heroes in the church in his work, especially in doing what he could do in World War II to save Jews from arrest and deportation in gas chambers.
That's right. He was assigned another task by Pius XII during the war, and that was to help with the massive refugee problem that they were facing because of the war. But also, he worked very quietly to save as many Jews as possible and to coordinate those efforts, again, very quietly. No one knew about it for a very long time. So he was aware immediately in the war of the problems of atheistic National Socialism, of Nazism. In exactly the same way that he was aware, because of his experience as a diplomat, as a young priest, of the crisis that was being caused by the Soviet Union. And as one of the great servants of Pius XII, he knew firsthand the accounts of what was happening behind the Iron Curtain in the 40s and into the 50s. And so he was aware, much as John Paul II was, but from a slightly different direction. John Paul II lived it, right. Nazism and the Soviet domination. Right. Paul was watching its toxic effects from the Vatican itself. So people have said that, well, he was soft on the communists, this policy of
well, because the Archbishop of the workers, etc., kind of.
Exactly. Right. In fact, when you read through his quotes about atheism, about atheistic communism, about socialism, he is as strong in his language against atheism, against Soviet communism, against communism of all forms, and socialism, as any pope you'll read, including John Paul II, even Leo XIII in Rerum Novarum.
Now, dealing with Humanae Vitae in the closing couple of minutes, now this came to this end. Pope John XXIII established a papal commission for the study of the problems of family population birth rate in '63, because artificial contraception, really the pill in 1960, really had come forward. People were trying to decide, is this licit or not licit?
That's right.
And a lot of the confusion I know that I remember hearing when I was a kid from my parents was the reports that would be put out in the press were how all these things were changing. And so when they didn't change, people were disappointed because they thought they were going to change.
This was one of the first examples within the life of the church in the modern era of the fake news, to use that term.
Right, exactly.
In which a result was desired and they pushed to achieve it, even though they knew what they were pushing was contrary to the teachings of the church. So they're built this expectation that, well, of course Paul is going to accept the findings of this commission, stacked as it was, and he will embrace contraception for the church. Paul prudently, very quietly, meditated on this. He studied it.
Hopefully led by the Holy Spirit.
Exactly. He reflected on this, and he read the reports. He read the minority report. He read everything, and there was only one conclusion he could reach. He was shocked at the reaction, especially the leaking of the report ahead of his decision.
Exactly.
That report was never supposed to be public. It was supposed to be given to his attention alone.
But that came out, it built expectations, so when that didn't happen,
he was understandably horrified that there would be this level of duplicity on an issue like this. And I think the reaction to it, in exactly the same way that Humanae Vitae was, both of those proved to be prophetic in the way that we're seeing dissent occur in the church. It tends to be accompanied by dishonesty, deceit, underhanded tactics, and ad hominem attacks. In Humanae Vitae, he predicted what would happen were that contraceptive culture to be embraced.
Right.
He was right on both counts.
That's where we are. He said, though it is true that sometimes it is lawful to tolerate a lesser moral evil in order to avoid a greater evil or in order to promote a greater good, it is never lawful, even for the gravest reasons, to do evil, that good may come of it.
That's right. It's a simple restatement of what the church has always taught.
Right.
And it's why Humanae Vitae tends to be looked at as a very straightforward, simple document. It simply restated what the church always believed. But those lines in Humanae Vitae where he predicts what will happen if it becomes of interest to the state for what it perceives to be the good of the state to begin imposing contraception on its population. All we have to do is look around the world today and look at the HHS mandate, you look at places like China, you look elsewhere around the world where you have the state now not just mandating contraception, but more and more mandating abortion, euthanasia, assisted suicide. Right. Once the state began down that road, and this brings us back to Paul's opposition to communism and socialism, once the state becomes that powerful and that invested in controlling its people, disasters follow exactly as he predicted.
Now, he had actually written a resignation letter, what, in '65 or something?
He did.
He never used it, but he did that.
That's right. Similar to the letter that we know that Pius XII penned should he be kidnapped by Hitler, something that, as Montini, prior to becoming Pope, Paul would have known about.
Do you think the Red Brigades were going to kidnap him?
I think his worry was, as his health was declining, that he was not going to be able to carry this burden. And it's impossible to appreciate, I think, the weight that he felt on his shoulders in the years after the council. I've made the comment that I think it seemed to him that he stood holding the pastoral staff in the middle of a storm, and he was standing there alone. I
thought this, is this the reason you picked this particular person to write about? He likewise proclaimed two new doctors of the church, both women, St. Teresa of Avila and Catherine of Siena, since you have such a great affection for the doctors of the church.
Those two women have so much to say to the world, and it was a demonstration of Paul's foresight that we now have 4 women doctors of the church. But one of the things he was also stressing throughout his whole pontificate was the importance of holiness, of saints. Right. And Paul was himself one, but it's that lesson of sanctity in the modern world.
Right. Another book in the works?
I hope so.
Okay, always stop by. It's always great to see you.
Same here.
People see on our TV, radio. He's ubiquitous when it comes. He's our go-to guy. That's Matthew Bunson, author of St. Paul VI, celebrating the 262nd Pope of the Roman Catholic Church. He's the Humanae Vitae Pope. That's what really matters, folks. Pick it up. It's available through the EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com. A very interesting read. Join us next time right here on Bookmark. Thank you.